Kelly, you walked 690 miles. I like how you said walked, too, in the book. You didn't say hiked. You didn't say, trekked. You said walked. I just kind of picture this guy just kind of taking his leisurely time to check things out. But you walked 690 miles from Kansas City to, I think in the book it says just south of Denver to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. What on earth was your motivation for doing that? And, what were you hoping to find along your way, and what did you come home with?
Well, in some ways it started as a childhood vision. Growing up in Nebraska, summer vacations out to the Rockies, seeing the mountains from somewhere in the high plains, Lyman, Colorado or somewhere. Somehow I got the idea that, God, wouldn't it be great to just walk out to those mountains. And then I got the prairie bug. I love prairies and prairie plants and loved land use and uses of the land, farming, etc. But was really had the prairie bug. So essentially, after undergraduate work, bounced around on jobs, having kind of a free summer, talked a friend into doing this trek. And with that trek, we walked primarily county roads, avoided paved roads, and then went cross-country where we could. The Flint Hills, the Smoky Hills, got permission from ranchers to cross their land. Wow. Trespassed a little, but, kept going west.
Yeah.
I went west until I was no longer in the prairie. We were seeing Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, and then Douglas fir. And once we got into the forest, it's like, okay, we've walked across the prairie.
Yeah, that's so interesting. You can see that transition when you're driving once you get the educated eye, but to be that intimate with it to where it's right next to you, it's on you're walking on top of it.
And an interest I have, and I still have, is the range of prairie plants.
Yeah.
So as you walk west, you both lose things from the east and you gain things from the west.
Yeah.
So that transition, and I took notes on that the whole walk. That was just fascinating.
Oh man, do you have a journal of that somewhere?
I have some notes. Not a full journal, but yes.
Yeah, that'd be awesome to be able to just peruse through there and see what was your what are some species that you noticed right away that, hey, I'm not seeing this anymore as you continued west?
Yeah, so you notice things around here like compass plant, lead plant. They go west quite a ways, out into central Kansas, but you definitely don't see them, clear out in the high plains. Mm-hmm. Flip side of that, you start picking up some things that you don't see further east. I'm thinking scarlet globe mallow. Even things that drift out of the Rockies, you start seeing penstemons that are different species, blue flowered, things like that. So just a whole variety of things.
Yeah, that's cool. I've spent some pretty decent time, I was telling you before we started recording, in the Sandhills and a little further west, and even it was more alpine ecosystem, but down in in kind of the valleys, it gets a little grassy in southern Colorado, and you still see a few different prairie plants there. And the one that I think has become my favorite western prairie species is blue grama. Just how it's everywhere.
Oh, and yes. I see that plant clear out into New Mexico, Arizona, even in Chihuahua.
Really?
Oh, yes. Huh. Yeah, I think it's state grass in New Mexico.
Wow. Yeah. And it's such a neat looking grass too.
Yeah.
And very so a lot of the ground I've been on, it gets grazed, and man, you can tell the large herbivores love blue grama.
That and buffalo grass.
Yeah. Yep. So what was your biggest takeaway from all of that?
Well, it's really watching the change at that time. One of the impetus was really having this love of prairies, and that was the time of the big plow out. Mm-hmm. So in the early 80s, they were busting out lots of the high plains for additional wheat and other crops that mostly failed, to be honest. A lot of that land went back into CRP, but you could make a lot of money by buying prairie lands, plowing them up, and selling them as agricultural land. So it's really sad to see that. So watching that change, and also, the whole talk of the Ogallala Aquifer.
Yeah,
that was something that we had lots of conversations about. And
So-
like one little comment that I remember someone talking about along the rivers was, well, those cottonwood trees, their roots just don't grow down fast enough anymore. And it's like, oh, you're pumping out the water, you're killing the trees, but now you're blaming the trees. It's the trees' fault they can't survive this.
Yeah. That's interesting. So that was a very marked, noticeable thing there, where the cottonwoods were dying out.
Yeah, and you now see that
the drawdown was
there's
so.
a lot less cottonwoods on rivers in the west, the Arkansas and Kansas, Smoky Hill.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a lot of tree die off in the west.
I just heard some data on this. So I just finished for the second time the worst hard time. We just had a dust storm sweep through the Midwest. We got the kind of the early taste of it in Iowa, and then Illinois is really where it culminated this spring. I don't know if you saw that in the news, where Chicago had its first dust warning since 1934.
Yeah.
And also earlier this spring, back in March, there was a Saturday morning, I woke up and all of the parked vehicles around us is where you could really see it on the windshields and hoods. Red Oklahoma dirt.
Yep.
And so that sparked me. It's like, I need to go back to this book and just reread. And people are probably sick of me talking about it on this podcast, but I just cannot emphasize it enough. You need to understand how bad the Dust Bowl was and how that was a largely man-caused event.
Yeah, that was climate change, human-induced climate change. It's not framed enough as that.
Right. It's exactly
and
what it was.
And it was so significant. Still, here in Kansas, our record high temperatures in Kansas are from the Dust Bowl time, not more recently.
Yeah.
Really?
Our worst drought still go back to the Dust Bowl times for the extent of that period of time. Not that we won't be there again.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's I feel like those early, I call them dusters because that's what they called them, and I think it's important to refer to them as that, as what they are. And like you said, the temperature. There's a part in that book where there's a guy living in Ina Vale, Nebraska, who kept a really detailed journal. One of the most depressing things to hear from, and he was taking surface soil temperature readings, pretty much daily, I think. And there were times where I believe he saw soil surface temps in the summer hitting 140 degrees. And I mean, you're talking, and I think it's an example of where humans forget that we're on a planet. We think Earth is home. It's something we control, something that we can count on staying within these certain limits that we can handle and we can adapt to. We don't think of it as, no, it's Mars' neighbor and Venus's neighbor. And why don't you go take a look at those places? Because planets can become very inhospitable places. And that's when I hear data like that and see those weather events like that, it kind of reminds us, no, this is a rock floating in orbit around a sun, and it's a planet. It's not just home.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
It's a warning sign, to be sure.
Yeah. So then the other book, Hal Herring, a recent guest who is on here, he told us about this book. It's called, I think it's Cadillac Desert, I think is what it's titled. And it was written in I want to say the 80s.
Yep.
And it's about the...
Mark Reisner, I think.
Yes. And he talked about the Ogallala aquifer and how quick the drawdown and how much faster the drawdown is than the refresh rate on that.
Yeah.
Do you remember the off the top of your head, the kind of data where we're pulling out of that aquifer, even still to this day?
Yeah. I mean, there's good maps of this, that the aquifers dropped 100, 200 feet in places. And
wow.
What that aquifer really is as the Rocky Mountains uplifted, you had major erosion. And you can see this in the streams today, that they're all sandy, gravelly streams coming out of the Rocky Mountains. The Ogallala Aquifer is essentially that. It is all that gravel sands washed out from the mountains, and that sand holds water. We're now pumping it out, of course, faster than it can recharge.
And a lot of that water got there from the last glaciation, right?
Yeah, some of it's fossil water. It is being replenished slightly, so there is some recharge, but not at the rates we're using it.
Is there issues with? I hear about aquifers and compaction. Does the Oglala have any issues with? Are the pores wide enough that it can slightly recharge? I know that it's not. Obviously, it will never line up to irrigation, but.
Yeah, the soils are generally pretty permeable, pretty sandy.
Okay.
And now we're finding, too, that the wetlands, these interesting basins called playa lakes, which are clay-lined basins, they really crack because they're clay, and they actually serve as direct channels into the aquifer.
Interesting.
There's very little runoff from out there, so the streams have sadly dried. So there's very little water that runs off. Okay. Now you get a lot of evaporation.
Mm-hmm. Could you slide your mic just a little closer, Kelly?
Yep.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you're able to observe that stuff, and I think what your story tells is obviously we're going to get into your research and the books you've written, and that's a lifetime of dedication. But anyone can go and look at these places themselves. They can take they can take a week vacation and go and see some of the. I mean, obviously a 690-mile walk that you got to set aside some serious time. But maybe this summer, take a little vacation and go and witness some of this stuff firsthand for yourself, because I think that's when you get the most impact. We can hear so many facts, we can see so many data tables, we can look at the charts, but it's till you see it with your own eyes that the impact is really a deep thing.
You'll start noticing too, there are center pivots that are being abandoned because water is getting marginal in places for profitable growing. Aquifer is not going to dry up. It's just going to reach an uneconomic point where it's too hard to pull up enough water for what you want to grow.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. And, it's one of those things where how we inhabit a place and what we do there, how long does that become sustainable? And we're going to talk a little bit about that term sustainable, because you had an interesting point in your book that I took a screenshot of and worked it into our notes here, a quote that I really like, but we're not there yet. We want to
I would make one more comment too about this whole area, and to me it's kind of a positive thing about prairies and prairie plants is despite the Dust Bowl, all those prairie species are still out there and fairly abundant.
Yeah.
That they were able to survive that 5 to 8 year period of time in which there was little or no growth. Yeah. They eked out survival. They, went to the seed bank. Their rhizomes persisted.
Yeah.
But they were there. They came back remarkably.
I'm glad you brought that up. I've wondered, the Dust Bowl region, if you go there today, and a lot of it was reclaimed, the federal government bought back those acres and have turned them into national grasslands, I believe, that are run by the National Forest
Service,
or Forest Service, when you go there, is it a lot of buffalo grass and little blue stem and maybe some side oats, grama, and some of those more mixed grass, short grass, prairie?
More short grass, but grama and buffalo grass depends on how it's managed today. Very little of that was replanted. It
all came back from the native seed bank.
And there were parts of it were rangeland.
Okay.
And then a lot of it was farmed.
Sure.
But amazing how you look at it today and you would not know that it was blown out, that it was abandoned. Those lands were abandoned. The banks were abandoned. The towns were sort of abandoned.
Right.
So this was like the holder of last resort was the federal government.
Yeah, right. And they planted some invasive... Well, I guess maybe invasive's too strong yet, but some non-native species. That was part of the plan to revegetate the area. Has that, been a major problem?
You don't see a lot of that.
Okay.
I mean, there's sweet clover, which was planted, and some things like that. But no, most of those areas, and in part the grazing's driven it, are pretty much shortgrass prairies. Okay. Some of it's also sand sage, so you get sand sage in some of those areas too, particularly in southern half of the Great Plains.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
So in your studying of native plants, have you ever done anything to research how long seed banks? Seed bank is is something we get asked about a lot.
Yeah.
You know, I think I might have a seed bank here. You know, obviously tillage effects, grazing effects, but is there, in your experience, how long do you think a seed bank kind of holds out?
Not a long time.
Not a long time.
I
Okay.
think you're talking, for the most part, years for most species, a few decades. Legume seeds are harder, will last longer, classic stuff. I can tell two stories on that. One of which, here at the University of Kansas, we have a really nice prairie remnant as part of our field station. In 1957, decision was made to kind of set up an experiment. So a little piece of this was just let go. Let go to nature, which around here, without fire, without any sort of management, is not how things were. We used to have fires 200 years ago. But that area grew up to trees. And about 5-10 years ago, decided to clear that and see what would, if any of the prairie species would come back. So that was from the 50s to, let's say, 2010. We didn't really get anything.
Okay.
The only things we saw were things that plausibly would blow in: asters, goldenrods, wind-dispersed seeds.
Okay.
So there was not a survival of the seed bank after those decades.
Okay.
That is interesting, because I often wonder that well, here's another one too. Roots on. So a good story is how our company, Hoxie Native Seeds, started. Was our founder, Carol Hoxbergen. He was raised conventional corn and bean farmer, and he through one of his friends wanting to hunt pheasants out on his farm, he's like, "Hey, Hoxie, do you got any places where we can hunt some pheasants?" He's like, "Oh, I don't know. I kind of got this old pasture here, and it's all foxtail and everything, and didn't have any luck." And so he's like, "You know what? I need to try." And he was just a bachelor living on the old family farm. He's so kind of in his off time, I guess you'd say, he said, "You know what? I'm going to take that old pasture and I'm going to plant it into some native grass," because he kind of learned about some native grass from a friend. And he made the mistake of planting too deep. Of course, this was back in the probably early 80s.
Sure.
And so his friend who told him about the native grass, well, maybe we need to burn it off, and all this foxtail was there and everything. And so they burned all that foxtail. When they did, the fire got out of hand a little bit and got into these cedar trees. And those cedars, went up like torches immediately. And, he's kind of feeling bad, like, oh, what a failed experiment. I've spent all this money on the seed, put all this effort in here, and I'm just not getting anything. Well, he went back and happened to take a look over where those trees were burned up. And here's Big Blue, Little Blue. Yep. I can't remember what other species came out of the rim. I really need to ask Carol that. But he had enough species to get it to be a certified remnant prairie. Yep. And that started him on this journey of leaving the conventional farming, growing native species. And in that case, I always wondered, was that seed stock, because they were all plants, species he didn't plant there, right? Was that seed stock that came back, or were those old root systems lying dormant?
I think it was old root systems, and probably there was plants growing that just not noticeable.
Sure.
Like between the cedar trees, just a little bit of growth. Probably weren't flowering at all, and
just kind of barely eking it out,
hanging on to life. Yeah,
but I think that, to me, the message there too is anything that is remnant is virgin soil. We used to say, but soils have never been plowed. Really should be managed differently, and you'd be surprised what it express itself in that situation. But once something's been plowed, and tilled more than 3 or 4 times, which if something's farmed, that's going to happen. It's just not going to resurrect itself.
Right.
Going to need help. Going to need seeds.
Yeah.
Right.
Some significant renovation to get the species back in there.
Yeah.
Which I do like calling, really we talk about prairie restoration. We're way too broad in that term, right?
Mm-hmm,
restoration is taking a remnant and improving it. Really, most of what we do that we call prairie restoration is recreation.
Yeah.
And we're starting with a blank slate.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good point. That is a good point. Okay, so it's like you knew my outline here, Kelly. Through your time living and working so close to prairies and in a post-prairie world, kind of, in a lot of ways, unfortunately, you've seen remnants. You've probably even found some remnants of your own before. And you've also seen a lot of these prairie reconstructions that we just talked about. But there's also been undoubtedly net habitat loss.
Absolutely.
The Iowa DNR has this fact in the beginning. I think they put it in the beginning of their roadside upland game report every year, where they go out and count quail numbers and pheasant numbers and cottontail and jackrabbit numbers. At the beginning, they say Iowa has lost a 10-mile wide band of habitat from Davenport to Council Bluffs, which is the whole width of Iowa, that I-80 corridor there. A 10-mile wide band of habitat. I think it was from the 1990s till today. That much habitat has been lost, which definitely encompasses your career. Yeah. And Iowa is one of the most extreme examples in our country, if not the most extreme, for habitat loss. But I imagine it's probably pretty similar here in Kansas as well.
In far eastern Kansas is no different than Iowa.
Yeah.
First 3 tiers west in Kansas is no different than Iowa in terms of loss of habitat.
Yeah. So what kinds of things have you seen as far as remnants being protected, seeing some maybe even lost? Overall, lost. What have you seen happen with the prairie in your...
Well, we're still losing it. I mean, as we speak, the county we're in, Douglas County here, where Lawrence is at, we've mapped carefully those remnants, and we're still losing them. We were over 100 really high-quality remnants left. We're down to probably 60 or 70. I've been involved and helped found a land trust. We've protected a few easements in Douglas County. I think we protected 3 populations of Mead's milkweed, endangered species, on remnants in this county. But it's barely a drop in the bucket. I mean, almost all lands are private property. The reason I like easements is it can be retained as private property. The university's gotten involved a little bit, but there's not a strong mission to protect these. We're developing an open space program here for our county, but that's just barely getting started. There's still not enough appreciation of prairie. And this county is, a liberal county, would be more open to that. The rural counties, there's, so not only losing them to the plow and development, but we have to talk about herbicide. We greatly degrade things. There's still, being promoted to have clean prairie hay, to have clean hay, to get rid of weeds. Every night you watch the news, there's herbicide commercials. I'd love to see, equal airtime for preserving prairie. But we're degrading what little we have left. And the mindset is that we should have clean landscapes. And that's really a shame. Now we're getting a little bit of attention because of pollinators. And I never would have guessed that pollinators might drive protection of biodiversity. But that's been a stronger voice for it than pretty much anything else in recent years. But it's still a negative trend. And that's partly why I had 2 main purposes of writing my book. Really, the first, strongest, my greatest interest is protecting prairie, speaking for prairie, being a voice for prairie and prairie plants. And then second is I really feel we need to honor the Native American tradition of using these plants, of relating these plants, and the stories that go with that.
Let's. I want to read. This is a good time to read a section that comes from one of your books here. So I'm gonna read this right now. Growing up in Willa Cather's home county, where in 1871 my great-great-grandparents also homesteaded in Webster County, Nebraska, I came to realize that her love of the prairie and her writings have not been appreciated locally, as agribusiness has come to define conservation and sustainability through an agricultural lens, where conservation means no-till agriculture with herbicide and sustainability means sustainable yields or sustainable profits. and prairie hardly exists. Man, that is a powerful statement.
No, I feel strongly that way. Words the meanings get warped, especially sustainable.
Yeah, greenwashed,
really,
right?
Yes, really doesn't have much meaning anymore, not defined at all.
Yeah,
and gets talked more about in terms of productivity.
Yeah, than
it does about in conservation terms.
Yeah, it's a good point. How do we get those two things to work together? We're never going to be perfect. There's never going to be a silver bullet. Human population is so much higher now than any other point in world history. Because of that, we have this very large demand for resources to support that population. And I recently learned, kind of a dark time in human history. A lot of us romanticize about the hunter-gatherer era, but Dan Flores, who's written some great books, A Wild New World is probably my favorite book that he wrote. That came out, I think, in 23 maybe. And he has a new podcast now called The American West. It's a great listen. But he was just talking about kind of he was coming out of the Clovis era of human history and how infanticide was practiced to regulate number of humans we have on the planet. And that picture doesn't feel so romantic anymore of, man, I could go out there and I could hunt bison every day and I could, I'd live off the land and that. And it's like, well, there was your clan or your tribe had to be able to keep everyone's mouth fed, and too many people meant tribe doesn't do well, maybe doesn't even survive, especially through the lean months of each year. And what really got humans out of that mode was agriculture, where
I don't agree with that.
Well, good. I'm glad we're getting into the weeds. Yeah. So, and I don't want to put words into Dan's mouth here. This is just how I interpret it as I was listening to his show there. But can we talk about that a little bit? Just like the need for agriculture and supporting the large human population, but also we can't destroy our natural world to have that.
Well, the first part I'd react to is I'm not sure the archaeological record shows that there was a lot of difficulty and starvation historically.
Sure.
I mean, sadly, people knew how to manipulate resources way back when. Agriculture is a kind of a continuum, and there's lots of evidence of hunting, gathering, modified agriculture. In the Midwest, for example, the crops that were pre-crops, chenopodiums, maygrass, others, persisted after corn was introduced. People still manipulated wild plants, maybe scattering seeds, maybe growing them, even after corn was introduced. Hundreds of years after corn was introduced, these wild foods were still scavenged. Yes, I'm sure there were some difficult times. I'm sure there was infanticide. But I don't think times were often very bleak. Now, if you had a drought period, sure, things are a lot harder.
Yeah.
And we have a population of people moved west. You have times when there were people living in western Nebraska, western Kansas that then retreated later, I'm sure because of climate change. Yeah. I'm not sure a lot of people died from those incidents. People are very, very resourceful.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed, corn and agriculture have allowed populations to grow, and we have that today. Although we're overproducing.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the positive things I see in terms of how we could get more prairie back is agriculture in our country is all about policy. It's not about profit and loss.
Yeah.
If the government doesn't support farmers, they would go broke.
Right, yeah.
Farmers farm the system that's in front of them. Sadly, they don't really, it's not really laissez-faire capitalist agriculture.
Right, yeah.
So if the government decided to take things in a little different direction, we would be in a different place. And
Yeah.
a really good example of this could happen easily is we really do not need as much corn in the future because we are going to move to having vehicles that run on batteries.
Right.
So, what, a third of our corn crop is currently going to
Yes,
ethanol?
Yeah. I think in Iowa it's over 50%, isn't it, Riley?
Yeah.
So think if not all of that, but let's say half of that was supported by different policy. I mean, we now subsidize corn agriculture because of the ethanol policies, right?
Right.
So that's subsidy. What if you took that same subsidy and said, we want to have habitats. We want to have habitats for hunting. We want the grazing that is going to continue on lands to be full of biodiversity.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's all policy.
Yeah.
We could do that. I mean, it makes as much sense as ethanol policy,
Right.
which it's not clear to me that ethanol policy makes any sense in terms of energy dynamics.
Right, yeah.
If you read the studies on that carefully, it's equivocal of whether there's more energy coming out of ethanol than going into it,
Yeah,
particularly in the way we farm.
Right. Yep. Yeah. It's you're bringing up a great point here, and it's a great time to transition to the other part of, well, the main part that we came for. This is what you've done the bulk of your research in, the use of native plants.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I love that explanation to, counter this idea of, look, there just wasn't enough around because you kill all the bison and what are you going to eat? But you have done the research to find that no. These plants aren't just good for bison fuel.
Right.
They're human fuel too.
That's right.
And so, Nicholas really wanted us. He was very bummed he couldn't come today. It's a good point to mention this. Nicholas had a bit of a family emergency come up over the weekend. I think everyone's doing okay now, but he is not able to be here. And he wanted to ask. I better just read it because it's a pretty specific question. He gave you a scenario here. So Kelly, it's the year 1600 AD. And you are tasked with surviving in the tall grass prairie ecosystem on a vegetarian diet. First of all, could it be done? And second of all, how would you go about it?
Sure, it can be done. Of course, you can't. You have to start in a preparatory sense. In that you can't start from zero. You already have to have food stored.
Sure, yeah.
It's a process, right?
Yep.
So are we pre-agriculture here or after?
Yeah, I guess 1600.
Let's do
would
pre.
Be,
let's
okay,
do pre.
Yeah,
Make
we'll
it more
go.
interesting.
Yeah, we'll go before agriculture.
Of course, I brought things to show you.
Awesome. I was hoping you would.
Yeah. So these are small, but these are some of the tubers of one of the food plants I'd be gathering, and these I'm starting to grow. But these are groundnuts. I like calling them hopnus now.
Okay. Yep.
Indian potatoes, which are famous, by the way. State capital of Kansas is Topeka.
Uh-huh.
And these actually are doe or toe in Kansas language. And Topeka is essentially a Ka word that means a good place to grow this plant.
Really?
Or a good place to harvest this plant.
That is so interesting.
This plant, if you read the historical literature, was abundant in our floodplains. It
Okay.
likes wet prairies, it likes sloughs, draws, and it makes huge amounts of these legume family tubers. These are kind of small, but they'll be hen to egg sized. They were harvested extensively. Native names for rivers are named after these. Places are named after these. This is just one of the plants that is not only full of carbohydrates, but these are protein rich.
Okay.
They're richer in protein than potatoes. They also have vitamin C. They're nutritious. They can be stored. They can be dug year round. These are just one plant that I would have already established where they were. I would be making my rounds to harvest them in patches I'd already harvested in before. And when you harvest wild plants, if you're harvesting roots, you're making disturbance in the ground. You're encouraging those to grow. Or maybe you plant more. Maybe you stick more in to make the patch a little larger.
Yeah.
The other plant that is really abundant in terms of just carbohydrates and nutrition, another prairie plant that's a legume family, is the prairie turnip.
Okay.
Or I like calling it Tipson. Melvin Gilmer, the ethnobotanist, said in the 1920s we should use that name, which is a derivation of Timpson-La, which is the Lakota name for the plant.
Okay.
And these legume plants also have a root. You have to be timely in when you harvest them in the summer. And the traditional practice of Native Americans is to harvest plants and return something, an offering of tobacco or corn. Or
Mind if I take a
you
look at
also
that?
put the, let me cut one open for you.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, these I was growing. I just brought them because I hadn't planted these yet, so they're not in prime condition. They've been in a pot.
Riley, describe what we're looking at here to our people that are just listening.
I would say it's about the size of a large radish.
Look at that carbohydrate.
Yeah,
but it looks,
wow.
I mean,
very
dense
starchy
and whiter than your average potato, really.
Much more solid. Yeah.
Smells very earthy.
Yeah. They actually have a raw peanut taste. Since these are starting to germinate, they're not going to probably be as tasty.
So how would you prepare these?
Oh, mainly cook boiled.
Okay.
Just like you would potatoes.
Yeah.
But you could do a variety of things. You could fry them. You could,
Okay.
But they're best cooked.
Are there?
And they're hard to come by. In fact, seed companies typically don't sell them.
Yeah, no, we don't sell those.
Right,
Yeah.
you should.
Yeah.
I mean, but why don't you?
Idea.
Well, you can't even get seed.
Yeah, right.
And the plants often are tetraploid and don't produce seed. The ones I
Okay.
grow in my yard are not seed producing. They'll flower. They don't produce seed. They propagate themselves by their tubers.
Yeah.
And they really benefit by having people move them around.
Sure.
I'm on a campaign to get people to plant these. You should definitely take that one home.
Yeah, I would love
to get that propagated. It's
hoping
even
you'd
sprouting.
offer.
Yeah. Take both of them, although I cut that one. They'll probably still grow. They're tough plants.
Here, Riley, you put one in your prairie.
Put one in my garden. Yeah.
You take the cut one. I'm taking the whole one here. Is it best to start these? Just go ahead and start them in the ground, or start as a plug?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's okay. So we got
that's
tubers.
One plant. The other one I mentioned was prairie turnip.
Yep.
Which a great passage I found was that the Omaha determined the route of their summer bison hunt, not by where the bison were. They'd headed out to western Kansas, western Nebraska to find them, but by where the women could harvest the choke cherries or the prairie turnips. And they would go camp there where those stands of prairie turnips or choke cherries were. The women would, with the kids around, would harvest them, dry them, prepare them, while the men went out to hunt. Of course, bison, you don't know exactly where they're going to be. They were more abundant in the high plains, but they returned to these patches. They were harvesting their prairie turnips when the seeds were ripe. They were returning the seed and plants to the disturbed ground where they harvested it. They were increasing their patches. I think one of the reasons that prairie turnips, Pedimellum esculentum, are not very common today, they're a rare plant in our prairies, is because people don't eat them. And that seems paradoxical, because if you eat that root, you're killing the plant.
Yeah.
But if you eat the root following a traditional practice, you're going to create a prairie turnip patch. And I think because people don't maintain those prairie turnip patches for the last 150 years, except on reservations, they're less common. We think of plants having native distributions that are divorced from humans. That's not true. A lot of the edge distributions of especially edible and medicinal plants are there because people planted them.
That is so interesting.
We know that in some cases there's some documentation, but it's obvious. Native people, all people know how plants grow, how to propagate them. Why wouldn't you move pecans or chokecherries or plums closer to where you're living in a convenient place? You'd know the habitat for them. You could plant the pits or seeds or move the tubers and do that. I like making the point, too, about prairies. In some ways, they're a unique ecosystem. We all lament how quickly they can grow up to trees.
Yes,
And part of the reason for that is we don't manage them the same way. We don't have bison doing the things that bison do, but we especially don't have fire. Prairie's only been around here, in Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, for about the last 10 to 12,000 years. Before that, it was colder, and we had, spruce, fir, cooler
larch,
climes.
all that,
As it started to warm, people came into this region. as it started to warm, the prairies moved back in from the south. They had refuge in the Ozarks, in Mexico, Texas, Southwest, but primarily southeast from here.
Yeah.
So prairies evolved.
We have multiple friends who just did a huge, what would you say there, fist pump or virtually patted you on the back, because the southeastern prairies are a new.
Yes.
I mean, people are now kind of going back further than written history suggests, finding that was a vast grassland down there in a lot of places as well.
That's right. Mm-hmm. So we know that fire is lacking today on prairies. When we look at the history of fire in this region, the majority of fires historically were set by humans for management, but also escape fires, campfires. Kids have always played with fire. Fires get away when it gets windy.
That's right, yeah.
But they were human set.
Yes.
And my point with all this is humans have always been involved in prairies. So our work in restoration, restoring these, the role of humans is ancient and essential.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so our mutual friend, the guy who recommended you to us, was Taylor Keene. And a good friend of his, who I would be surprised if you knew as well, is Charles C. Mann, the author of 1491 and 1493, two other books that I hope every podcast listener here reads or listens to at some point. There's an excellent point, I believe it's in 1493, where he talks about he's spitballing a little bit, I think, which I like. I love when people who've done extensive research do a little hypothesizing. He talked about how the Little Ice Age, which was 1500s, right? Yeah. So it was kind of wasn't that kind of the tail end? Maybe a 100-year period or something. Yeah. That was after a large die-off of indigenous Americans because of disease brought over from Europe. Smallpox mainly, and it is believed that during that time there was less burning going on, which changed the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, which caused global temperatures to kind of drop a little bit because of less carbon dioxide being part of our greenhouse gas layers in our atmosphere. And it was an interesting connection that it lines up time wise, and kind of when you think of how many millions of acres of prairie there were, and how much smoke and how much, you can see it during CRP burning season, which is not the right time to be burning prairies, by the way, in Iowa. In March really is when most people are doing it. Just setting the table for smooth brome there. That when it's the burning time of year, you see smoke all over on the horizon, and you're talking someone's burning a 25-acre patch. Imagine if everything that you could see was on fire, the amount of smoke that would produce in the atmosphere. It's just an interesting thing that I think, ties to supports what you're saying there with just how much burning was done and how closely it was tied to human behavior. And certainly there was some natural fire that was occurring too. I heard somebody was, I can't remember who it was, Riley. It was somebody we had on the podcast maybe recently talked about, they looked up how many lightning strike started fires had happened just this year, and they were like totally astounded by how frequently that happens too. And so there's point being, a lot of prairie burning, Native Americans were doing most of it. And that really shaped the health of our landscape.
And of course, historically, if a fire started, who was going to put it out?
Right, yeah.
I love, there's a documented case from western Kansas of a fire starting near the Arkansas River and burning 200 miles into Nebraska.
Wow. That's crazy.
Right, but there was no big river or rock outcrop or something to stop it.
Yep.
Eventually, the winds changed, or it hit a green wet spot or something.
Can you imagine how fun that was to to be the person who got to drop the first bit of flame on the grass and just let it go, and then just to see the change. I always love about a week after the burn to see that green emerging in the.
Well, and there's not enough known about, written about, but obviously part of the burning was to manage bison.
Yeah.
To move bison into an area that might be more favorable for your hunting.
Yep. And give them more food to have bigger herds.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. All very fascinating when you look into that. What are some of your other favorites? What about so roots, good source of carbohydrate, protein. What about greens?
Yeah, greens, and that's all these seed companies, they're not, offering our native weed seed, I'm very fond of chenopodium and lamb's quarters and amaranths. Both of those are really, really good food.
So
and we find that
I didn't know those were native. So lamb's quarters are native?
Yes, we have both native and non-native. Amaranths, we have native and non-native.
Sure.
There's definitely native varieties that are tasty, edible.
Yeah, I have heard of people eating lamb's quarter in amaranth.
In fact, one of the best greens right now is prime time. Boil them with a little bit of salt and butter. They are tasty.
Is it kind of like asparagus, or would it be kind of like asparagus? Or do you not eat the stems really?
Yeah, no, stems are good too if they're tender. You just pick the tender tops parts. They're a little distinctive, different tasting. They're probably closer to spinach in taste, but they have their own signature. We know they were collected extensively. Archaeological sites are full of chenopodium seeds. The seeds are also used as food. We also know historically that the use of those plants continued into agriculture. And today, still, folks in Latin America, traditional folks in the Southwest and elsewhere, if you grow corn, you tolerate or encourage your chenopodiums, your amaranths. You cut those for greens as you're tending your corn crop.
That's so interesting.
So they were important foods. And I mention them because when we do restorations today, prairie restorations, we really should encourage some of those weedy species. We should certainly encourage the edible and medicinal plants, because I think we need to have people more involved in these restorations. And if there's plants for people to harvest as individuals, and I'm thinking particularly in suburban areas where there's more people, I think we'll get more appreciation for prairie. We'll also get more hands involved in management.
Yeah.
If people care about something, if they're going out there to harvest plums so they can have wild plum jelly, or if they're going out there to get some greens because it's an early successional part of the prairie restoration, and they can harvest some greens, people will get much more excited about that restoration project.
Man, that is such an interesting point. Okay, so there's our greens. It seems like I heard, is it arrowroot? That was another commonly utilized.
More in wet sites and
wet prairies.
Backwaters. Well, even wetter than that.
Okay, semi-aquatic plant.
Yeah, like old oxbows or lands have been inundated and flooded, so there's not a lot of vegetation left. They can actually grow in the water. They have nice tubers too.
Okay, so that's another common one. What about the asters and stuff like that? That's a huge percentage of prairie forbs.
Yes.
Were those utilized for food much?
Not for food. They're a little too bitter. Asters and goldenrods are too bitter and don't have big seeds. Both those are used in medicine. Both are medicinal plants.
Okay, which we're going to talk about, right? I would definitely want to get into the medicine side of it. Okay, Riley, you got any?
I got one more. Eastern gamma grass.
Yeah.
Yes,
so Eastern gamma grass is getting a lot of attention in the grazing world.
Yeah.
As the ice cream of grass, as it's been called.
Yeah.
But what about its potential for food usage? It's similar to corn.
Yes.
The kernels are
closely related.
Yeah.
In fact, until recently they thought it was a progenitor.
I'd read that.
But now they recognize it's not. Seeds have been used as food. There's in the Great Plains Midwest, one of the problems for archaeologists is that everything rots. There's no caves. It rains a lot, so it's harder to find food things. So we get clues from elsewhere. So in this case, with Eastern gamma grass, there are bags of seeds collected that are in Ozark caves in Missouri and Arkansas. So they were used as
just
food.
Old food caches?
Yes, used as food. Problem with Eastern gamma grass, got a very tough, hard shell, essentially seed coat. But if you pound them up, you can
Like a
deal
good
with that,
meal.
and yeah.
More like a kind of like a cornmeal equivalent, kind of. Yeah.
A lot of things
That's
were
really interesting.
used that way. Another example of how foods are used differently is the nuts that we think about, walnuts, hickory nuts. Boy, it's hard to shell them, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, you can just pound up the whole thing into powder with, like, I'm talking big,
Mallet or something.
motor pestle, big time.
Yep.
Boil it, skim off the oil, and you have great food.
Get all
So
the
you don't have to
tannins
deal
and
with the
stuff.
shell and the
Yep.
nut meats. You're after the oil. And you can pound up a lot of hickory nuts if you think about it, if you've got the equipment to do that. So a lot of foods are figured out ways to use them that facilitated their use that we don't really think about today. But one more thing on Eastern gamagrass, the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, working on perennial grain crops, they're one that they've looked at, and there's some potential with it, although I think they've moved on to other things.
Yeah.
But it is the largest grass seed
It's
in the
tempting.
region.
You look at the
Yeah.
seed and you think, okay, you can plant it with a corn planter. I've seen,
Yep.
some guys do
Yep.
that,
Yeah,
And all grass seeds are edible. The question is, how easily can you get to the endosperm, to the carbohydrate?
Yeah. Yeah, a friend of ours who I would assume you probably know, Laura Jackson from University of Northern Iowa. She's done quite a bit of research. And I think her parents, they worked out with Land Institute. I
Her
think.
dad
Her
founded
dad-
the Land Institute.
Okay,
Dad
yep,
and mom actually founded the Land Institute.
Were they also looking into what was it? Was it rosinweed?
Yeah.
Or,
So I've done some work on that too. Rosinweed is going to be the sunflower replacement. They're making good progress with that. A nice oil seed that's a perennial plant, very drought tolerant.
Yeah.
And of course, the big one is Kindscher, which is a grass. It's viewed as a wheat substitute. And that's now commercialized a little bit. You can get Kindscher flour, which really high in bran, but the flour's there and it's also being used in some beer. You can get Kindscher beer.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's really interesting to see that it's already starting to move that direction.
Yep.
That's encouraging to see.
Yeah.
So what about things like the wild rye? Would those have been used by indigenous people much for like what we use rye for our food uses?
Yeah, the seeds aren't very big.
Mm-hmm.
All grasses were potentially used as food, and we find remnants of grass seeds in hearth areas where people cooked. Again, it was figuring out techniques for separating out that endosperm.
Right.
So I don't know about wild rye being used directly, and if you look at those seeds, they're pretty encased in glooms and pretty small. So I think they were not a favorite. But I don't doubt that someone figured out a way to singe, pound, use, and get some amount of flour or something out of them.
What about buffalo grass? That's a pretty large seed.
I haven't seen that one used. Although you keep mentioning blue grama.
Yeah.
Grama grass seeds have been used as food.
Okay.
And they're also extremely tiny.